I want to be on the floor tonight if that's all right with y'all. It makes me closer to you. I feel like I'm down here with you, and I appreciate that. Well, if you're hungry, it's your own fault. Really enjoyed our time this morning being together and worshiping and engaging ourselves in spiritual things. That is certainly our goal. That will be our goal the remainder of the week. And appreciate you being here to help us with that. This morning, we talked about marriages that thrive and not strive. And then we talked about some things that relate to what our children need, what our kids need. And tonight I want to talk to you, as I have indicated, I want to talk to you about what I call 10 Commandments for young people. And I want to make some observations. First of all, this is a fluid sermon. And really what I mean by that it continues to change. I guess I could make it 25 commandments for young people, but it just doesn't resonate quite as much. So I'm just going to keep it at 10, and plus I don't want to keep you too long. But these are things that my observations, I think, are things that young people need to hear. And a lot of my life has been involved with just being around young people and even trying to help them some spiritually, and I'm grateful for those opportunities that I've gotten. So some of this is a result of things that I've seen, things that they've told me, and things that I think they need to hear. So I hope that you'll understand that. And when I make this point, I want to say to you, if there are things when we finish that there are things that you say, you know, I think this would be a really good point, I'd like for you to share that with me. You can write it on a piece of paper and give it to me, or you can email it to me or text it to me. I don't mind sharing my number with you. And I'd love for you to help me. So if there are things that you think would be helpful, please send them to me. And because I'm always interested in that. You know, we preachers like to take other people's ideas a lot of times and try to make them our own. I think I can say this. Sometimes we steal things. I think you understand the context in which I say that. But I would be glad to share some things that you think would be important. And I would appreciate that very much. So it's fluid. And then it's not an exhaustive list. I mean, we can sit here all night and come up with things that we think would be important, and that's kind of what this lesson is. This is not some great in-depth lesson. This is just some things that I think would be important for young people to hear. And they're based on my observations and thoughts, and they're based on, as I say on the chart, on some biblical admonitions that I think are important. So keep that in mind, and then finally, they'll be expressed positively and negatively. Sometimes I just need to say, you know, as a young person, I want you to think about this by doing this, and sometimes they say you don't need to do this, and that's what some of these are going to be. So I think that'll be pretty obvious for you to see. So I appreciate your willingness to listen to all these things tonight, and we're going to kind of run through these. I'm not going to take a long time. At least that's not my plan. You'll be out here by 8:30 or 9 at least, so don't worry too much about that. Well, the first thing, some of these are going to be fairly obvious, some may not be quite as obvious, but the first thing that I would suggest is that young people, and let me say this before I begin, these are not just exclusively for young people. I mean, how do you even define what a young person is? I mean, you say young, I mean, I think I'm young to some degree, but I think we all understand specifically maybe who I'm thinking about because of all of our affinity for younger folks and the way in which we want them to understand and to obey God. All of us ought to have that as an objective, but sometimes it is a little bit more difficult for younger people, I think, and I think that's an accurate statement. At least I think that way. As I get older, it's hard sometimes to be a Christian, but I think as I get older and as my thoughts and my ideas are shaped, sometimes a little clearer in my head, sometimes a little less clear in my head. But nonetheless, it's important for all of us at any age to consider these things. But I think the first thing that I would suggest is that, and these are in no special order and they're not sequential, but I think they're important. See the value of the spiritual side. Here's why I say that, because in this day and age, and we're going to talk about this some during the week, but in this day and age, the secular and the sensual and the physical and the carnal, all those kinds of things have such an appeal to all of us, but I think particularly to young people. I can remember being a young person and understanding how important those things were to me, and I think certainly such is the case today, maybe even in a greater capacity. But the wise man said, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. I think one of the most difficult things for a young person is to understand the value of the spiritual side. That's a challenge, and I'll go back to maybe the lesson this morning. That's one of the challenges, I think, as parents, to try to help them understand that. That's the kind of thing we need to teach them, and we need to assure them of, and to help them see that. And that's a hard thing, because that's a hard thing for those of us who are older. I'm not talking to you about something that's easy, either as a parent or as a younger person, as a teenager or a child. I understand how hard it is, but you have to understand that this life is fleeting. And soon, maybe sooner than we think, the spiritual things are going to take the utmost importance in our lives. So remember to see the value of those things that are spiritual. And we'll say more about that in lessons as we go throughout the week. But I just want to make that point to you because I think it's important. And then this passage from Daniel, the first chapter. Daniel is one of the great character lessons. If you're talking to young people, obviously, you talk about his life. It's not just his life as young Daniel, it's his life as old Daniel too. He was consistent throughout his life. But early in his life, remember when he was taken into captivity and he finally got to Babylon with those others who had come, had been taken into captivity. Verse 1 of chapter 8 tells us when Daniel was told what he was going to do, what he had to do in order to please the king. That tells us, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. I think this is an important point for young people. I think, again, it's an important point for everybody, and I won't continue to say that, but I just want to emphasize that early in this lesson. Daniel was a long way away from home. And he decided, I think long before he got to Babylon, that he was going to do the right thing. This passage tells us that, I think it's the New King James says he purposed in his heart. Other translations say he made up his mind. And let me just say this to you. If you're wanting to do what's right, particularly as a young person, and I hope that you do, you're going to have to decide that and make that decision. And then once you make that decision, then those other applications, however you have to apply that one decision, is going to become a lot easier for you. I think Daniel decided. I don't think he sat there and debated whether or not he was going to take part in what the king's delicacies were going to be. He'd already decided that, made up his mind to do that. And so I'm going to suggest to you as a young person, you need to think about situations where you may have to be asked to compromise what you believe, what your convictions are. And I hope they are your convictions. But you need to do that ahead of time and make some decisions that are going to affect you to the good so that you're going to be what God wants you to be. But make up your mind early that you're going to do those things. And then thirdly, you need to seek wise counsel. This passage I have on the screen, 1 Kings 12 and verse 8, but he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him. That, of course, is what Rehoboam did when it was time for him, rightly or wrongly, it was time for him to take over, and he wanted to find out what was best for him to do as the king. And so he went to those who were older, those who had wise counsel, and he didn't like what they told him. And the passage tells us that he consulted. I think it's interesting. It says he consulted the young men who had grown up with him. You would think, don't you, that those people who had grown up with him would have given him some sound advice? But they didn't do that. Unfortunately, he listened to them, and that got him in some pretty serious trouble. And so let me encourage you as a young person, when you're seeking the advice of someone, go to the people who you know love you. Go to the people who have some wisdom. Go to the people who have some experience. And ask them, what is it that they think you should do? Go to them because you seriously want to know. And go to those people who can give you this wise counsel. It may be a parent. I would certainly recommend that. If you have godly parents, I would certainly recommend that you listen to them. That would be the ultimate that you should do. But if that's not the case, or even if it is the case, you may seek advice from other people. There's a wealth of people here among these spiritual people that you could draw from. Elders and elders' wives, and preachers' wives, and teachers' wives, and just all sorts of folks here you can draw from. So make sure, sometimes it may not be what you want to hear, but sometimes it's what you need to hear. I can think in my lifetime about advice I have gotten. And that doesn't mean that you can't ask your friends and those you've grown up with what you ought to do or consult with them. But you need to weigh that very carefully. You need to understand that sometimes they may be telling you things that they think you want to hear as opposed to things that you need to hear. So I would encourage you very strongly to think about that. I can tell you, and you know this, and there may be some here. I know a lot of younger people and even some older people who listened to poor advice when they were younger. And as you know, sometimes when that advice is given, when that advice is received and taken and executed, sometimes life tends to go a direction that's not good. And sometimes it's just one thing after another, and that continues to mount. I've seen that in my life over and over again. And so always do your best to get good advice. I think that would be a great thing for you to remember. And then also pay attention to yourself. I love this passage from 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16, where Paul tells Timothy to take heed to yourself and to the doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you. I fully understand that Paul is writing to a man who is an evangelist. He's a relatively young evangelist. And he's writing to someone, but he's giving him this admonition because this is such a critical thing. I have seen, unfortunately, I've seen men, both young and old, succumb to certain temptations and to certain pressure. And you know, just practically one of the most unfortunate things about this is these people are very knowledgeable. They're astute many times in what the Bible says, and they're able to articulate that so well. But the problem is, because of their life and because of what they have engaged in, mistakes that they have made, people are unwilling to listen to it. And that's a mistake. So Paul would say to Timothy, and I think this is perfectly by design. He says, take heed to yourself. Some translations say pay attention. First thing he says. He doesn't say, make sure you study, make sure as you talk to people about the sound doctrine. He doesn't say, make sure you do that well. Now, he does say that in other places, but the first thing he says is pay attention to yourself. And may I suggest to those who are young and all of us, I'm going to make this point later in the week in one lesson when we talk about being careful, but we need to make sure that we pay attention to ourselves. Young people, you've got to do that as well. So please remember that. Pay attention to yourself. That has to do with your character. You need to do that. And then I mentioned this passage this morning. You need to be concerned about your reputation. People think something about you. You know, a lot of you didn't know me. I didn't know a lot of you, and I've been with you now, you know, for about 24 hours, and, you know, you've probably established some sort of idea about me, and you just simply, maybe by observation. That's the way that is, okay? So we observe that, and we've got to be careful that what we do says the right thing. This passage tells us that there were those in Derbe and Lystra. And he says, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed his father was Greek, but he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. As I said to you this morning, I made a statement this morning, and I just kind of, again, mentioned that this evening. People think something about you. And a lot of times if I'm in an assembly like this, if I'm close enough to a younger person, I don't know that I want to do that tonight, not yet, but sometimes I might mention a person's name and just say, if all of you could tell me what you think about that person, what would they say? I could say that about everybody in here. And while that may not be the essence of who we are, we may have a reputation, and people may observe us, and they may be wrong about who we are. They may make a mistake. But most of the time, as people observe us, if they consistently observe us and look at us from day to day, they can make a pretty good description. They can have a pretty good idea of the kind of person we are. And as people, as Christians, we need to always be aware of that. And young people especially, let me encourage you. Understand that the kind of life you live is going to say a whole lot about you. So you need to be careful how you do that. And then this passage in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 2. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. I want to spend just a second on this. Because we live in a world that is so, shall I say, it's so secular. And the kind of things that ought to be more important to us sometimes aren't more important. Because of that, I think it's important for us as parents and even as young people, to understand that you're going to learn valuable lessons in places that maybe you don't want to go. Maybe you're going to learn valuable lessons in places that you don't want to be. One of the greatest, most important lessons I've learned, and I think I learned this as a child, was in my high school years, I obeyed the gospel. And not long, just within a week or two after I obeyed the gospel, my dad came to me one afternoon. He said, "Kenny, we're going to start singing at the Leisure Lodge." Leisure Lodge, you can kind of just hear Leisure Lodge, and you know what kind of place it is, right? It was what we used to call an old folks home. It's an assisted living facility now. He said, "We're going to have a service once a month on a Sunday afternoon, and you're going to lead singing." It wasn't a question. He didn't pose it in question for me. It wasn't, "I'd like to ask you." It wasn't that. No, he said, "You're going to lead singing." I said, "Well, I said, that's a Sunday afternoon. I did a lot of things I want to do on Sunday." And I got about halfway through that explanation. And he just said, "You need to pick out your songs and be ready." Well, there wasn't any conversation. So I decided, I didn't decide, I didn't have much choice in it. But I went. I wasn't real happy about it, but I went. And the first Sunday, that first Sunday afternoon that I got there, Dad got there, and he could read me like a book. He knew exactly how to handle me. And I told him, I said, "Listen, I'm going to stay outside, and when you're ready for me, you come get me." He said, "Okay." I stood outside. They got all the guests in the facility who wanted to come in. They came into that area, into the lobby, and had them all there. And I came outside, and he said, "We're ready for you." I walked in, led the singing, and when it was over, I walked out. Second month, same thing happened, except when I got through leading singing that morning, I saw a lady from the other side of the room, and she was doing this. She was in a wheelchair doing this. And I said, I kind of thought she was talking to me, but I kind of didn't want to talk to her. She kept doing this, and so finally I looked over and I said, "Like, you want me to come over there?" And when I did that, she went, "You got a little faster." So I knew that we had made the connection. So I went over there, and when I got over there too, she said, "Are you the young man that led singing?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Man, you did a good job." I don't know if she said "man," but that's the way I tell her. A little license here, you understand. So when she said that, I said, "Well, I appreciate it." And I went outside. The next month, when we got there, I didn't wait outside. I came in. You know why I came in? I wanted that lady to see me. So I came in, and when she came in, she spotted me. This was on the way in before the service even started, and when she saw me, she waved, and I waved back. You know where this is going. And the fourth month, when I got there, I told my dad, "I'm going to go get her." Nobody else was going to wheel her out, but I was going to wheel her out. And I did. And we struck up a conversation. We struck up a friendship. And the reason that I remember that is that I can remember other people commending me, because as a relatively young person, I was willing to go lead singing once a month at an old folks' home. And I've told this story a lot of places over the years, and I will tell you, I wasn't the one that needed to be commended. It helped me a whole lot more than I helped anybody. It taught me the value of going to what maybe it wasn't a house of mourning, but I'll tell you what, folks, it was pretty close. You been there? It's not the most enjoyable place for a ninth grader or for a 90-year-old. It's not, but sometimes it's what has to be. And one of the things that my dad was teaching me was the value of everybody and the importance of me being willing to spend my time at places where maybe I didn't want to be. But he knew what it would teach me. And there are a lot of mistakes that I've made in my life, and there are a lot of weaknesses that I have, but I'm grateful to my dad because he forced me to take part in something at a place where I didn't want to go. He forced me to do something that I didn't want to do. And it's one of the greatest lessons I've ever learned. Am I telling you, am I suggesting tonight that you ought to send your kids to the hospital to visit the sick, or that you ought to, when they're 3 years old, send them to a funeral. I'm not telling you your business. I'm not. But I am saying that there are great lessons learned in places that sometimes our kids don't want to go. And sometimes there are lessons learned in places we don't want to go.
Amen.
And we need to evaluate ourselves and make sure that we're doing the kind of things that teach us those kind of lessons. It was one of the greatest lessons of my life. And I'm great. I talk to my dad, and every time I pass, the place is still in business, and every time I pass it, I think about it. I think about it directly. This passage in Ezekiel 23, I don't know if you've ever thought about this. If you turn it up, why don't you go ahead and turn to Ezekiel 23? I just want to make a comment or two about it. It might be easier for you. You can turn there if you want to. You can, tonight when you get home before you go to sleep, you can read Ezekiel 23. But here's what I want you to do. Well, as you're reading the chapter, I want you to notice the imagery that's filled in that chapter. Okay? I'm talking about it's everywhere. Sometimes I take the time to read all. I'm not going to do that tonight, but there's a lot of imagery in there, and let me tell you what it is. It's imagery about sexual sin. Verses 2 and 3 say, Son of man, there were two women, the daughters of one mother. They committed harlotry in Egypt. They committed harlotry in their youth. Their breasts were their embrace, and their virgin bosom was their breast. And he's talking about Israel. He's talking about Judah. He's talking about the problems and the fact that they committed, in essence, spiritual adultery with other nations. And the way that he gets them to understand it is he uses this kind of language. And this is not the kind of language that we would talk about all the time. We have to be selective about how we talk about it. But I want to ask you a question. Why would he use this kind of language all the way through this chapter? I mean, it is prominent. And it is pointed. And as you read that, just think about it. This is the kind of language, this is the kind of imagery that God wanted them to understand, because he wanted them to get the picture of what was going on with them. And I think he did that, first of all, because spiritually they were doing that. But I think he also wanted them to understand, you can't involve yourself in that kind of activity. So that's why that's important. And I know how difficult it is as a young person to avoid that kind of thing and to push yourself away from that kind of activity. Listen, all of us who are older, all of us in this auditorium understand that. But you have to trust that the Lord knows what he's talking about. And while this is not the only place, Paul talks about flee fornication, and he talks to Timothy about other things. And there are other places in Scripture that talk about this particular problem that people have. But we've got to do our best to avoid sexual sin, whether you're young or whether you're old. And that application finds itself in all sorts of areas of our life. I mean, pornography it's just out of control. And I'll just tell you that I'm confident that it affects people here. Don't get mad at me for saying that. But folks, it's just rampant among a lot of people, and it's affecting Christians. And I'm just going to tell you, if you have a problem with it, you need to get help. This lesson's not about that. And I'm sure Brian and Adam and others talk to you about that and are concerned about that, but that is something you need to get a hold of. So be aware of that. And if you're young, understand that you don't need to engage in that kind of activity. Just save yourself for the right situation. And that is, when you marry, give yourself to the person fully. And it'll be a wonderful, wonderful way to share with your spouse. And then, manage your media. Wow. This is one of those fluid points, 20 years ago, or 25, or whenever it was, I started preaching a lesson like this. I don't know that I had a manage your media point. If you don't say manage your media now, you're missing the boat, right? Cyberspace is here to stay. I hate that because I love a newspaper. Those of you who are younger don't know what a newspaper is. Some of you remember a newspaper. But the point is, you always need to put God first. Seek his kingdom first. And if you'll just make that principle your priority, then some of the applications that all of us have to, even I, as old as I am, am engaged in some level of social media. And I have to be careful about that. All these folks that text me and call me and say, I'm going to give up my account. I'm not against that. If that's what you want to do, that's your business. But I think the better advice is just manage it. Be disciplined enough to use it wisely, just like you ought to do your television. and any other media that you have, you got to just be disciplined about that, and you make good judgments about that. And if you're young, please understand that what you put on social media outlets and all that can come back and haunt you, not just for a day or two, but for the rest of your life. Please be careful. But you want to say the right things about yourself. You want to always, you want people to always know that you're a child of God, and that that's the priority in your life. And you're not going to put anything out there that's going to indicate otherwise. I'm disappointed. Now, not in anybody here, but I'm disappointed in even some folks that I'm very close to, that I'm familiar with, and friends of mine, and maybe some of their children. All of us understand what I'm about to say. You see things that just disappoint you about that person. You just can't believe that they did. You can't believe they couldn't see that, right? You know what I'm saying? Because you see things or you read things and you're going, did you not understand how that's going to come across, what that's going to say about you? But yet people do that. So the point in this point is you need to manage that. Understand that kind of thing happens and be very careful about that. And then let me suggest this from Numbers 14. This is about Caleb. My servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, has followed me fully. I will bring him to the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. I'm just going to make this point. Well, this is not a lesson about Caleb and all the things that he did in his life, but I'm going to say this to you. He was a man. He was one of just two, really, spies who set himself apart. We're told that it was the leaders in all the tribes who went and spied out the land. I mean, these were the best of the best. I mean, this was the high-end people, okay, in terms of character. And yet Caleb and Joshua particularly set themselves apart. And here's what I'm seeing. I see a lot of young people that they know they ought to be what God wants them to be, but they're just not willing to really put forth the effort. And again, this can apply to a lot of us. They're just not willing to put forth the kind of effort that would say, I really want to be somebody, not because I'm trying to be better than everybody. It's not any kind of way like that, but it's because I really want to please God. So I'm going to be the best that I can be. And I'm not going to be mediocre. Too many people, too many of us, too many Christians settle for mediocrity. And that's not going to get us anywhere with God. And it's sure not going to say what we want to say to the world. So don't settle for mediocrity. If you're going to commit to the Lord, then commit to the Lord and follow Him fully. And this passage tells us He has a different spirit in Him. You're going to be seen. And again, not that this is the objective, but people are going to look at you and go, there's something different about Him. That's what you want people to say. Not so they'll talk about you and brag about you, but you want people to see something different in you because that's what you've intended to do. That's really who you are. That's what Caleb is. And that's who I encourage all of us to be. And particularly do I encourage young people. And then finally, this is my last point. I want to suggest that you become evangelistic. Remember this passage in Acts 8:4, therefore those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Well, I'm going to get on a little soapbox here just a second, if that's okay. I realize that younger people sometimes have less maturity, even spiritually, obviously spiritually. And in every way. And that's natural. You haven't lived as long. You don't have as much age on you as those who are older. I understand. But I'm going to say this to those of you who are younger. You are critical to what is happening in the Lord's church right now. You're critical. It's not about what you can do in the future. And I realize that's important. I know I'm talking to young people that in 20 or 30 years, some of you young men may be elders, or you may be the wife of an elder, or there are a lot of things that can happen. But you're such an important part of what's happening right now. Where I'm at, in Florence, we have approximately between 40 and 50 college students that worship with us. We're right next to the university. And I share this message with them a lot. We have we've added several younger couples where there's a lot of energy, and that's not any kind of negative statement about those of us who are older. But I'm going to tell you what, folks, there's a lot of energy when you get young people that want to do what they ought to do. And it can help a church. And that's important to this church. So I'm going to say this to you. Those of you who are in middle school or high school, And even those of you who are in elementary school, if you're doing the right thing, you can make such a difference in the lives of people. And a lot of your peers are going to ask the question, well, why don't you say those words? Why don't you wear those clothes? And why don't you act this way? Why can't you go to this? And why don't you? And instead of making excuses about that, we need to, in a nice way, we need to say, I'm trying to serve God. That's what I want to do. And when you do that, you can become evangelistic. You don't have to know how to teach the gospel to people. There are others who can do that. You may be too young to really have been able to understand that yet and to accomplish that. But you can make such a difference. You can have such an influence. And in the research that I've done and that I've read, this is what's interesting. You know that most people decide what they're going to experience by the time they're 25 years old? Isn't that interesting? Now, that's not to say that if get that out of work. That's not to say that if you run across somebody who's 26, you say, "Oh, I can't talk to you. You're past 25." But it is to say that a lot because they're very flexible. You get that, don't you? They're trying to figure some things out. I mean, I can remember when I was in my early 20s, when I was in high school, just thinking about some things. And I have godly parents, and I'm grateful for that. But I saw young people, and even today where I'm at. You know, a lot of our visitors, you know who invites them? The classmates, or their teammates, or somebody in their neighborhood, just friends of the neighborhood, because they won't invite them. And a lot of times those young people will react. So how important are you? You're critically important. Yeah, I understand. It's important to have Brian, and it's important to have Adam, and it's important to have all these women that can teach, and these elders and their wives. It's important to have people that can teach. I get that. I'm all for that. I know how valuable that is. But you must understand how important you are to the Lord's kingdom today. And if you'll do it now, you know what you're going to form? You're going to form a habit that as you get older is going to not only serve your purpose as well, godly purpose, but it's going to serve the kingdom. Amen. And I hope that you're keeping those things. Those are 10 things I want you to keep in mind. Okay? Appreciate your kind attention. If you have a spiritual need tonight, we can help you with it. We want to help you. As I said this morning, we point you to the one who can do that for you. We can help you tonight. Come as we stand.